Jeremy, welcome to the DevOps Diaries podcast. Thank you for coming on.
Yeah, thanks, Jack. Thanks for having me.
You're very welcome. It is absolutely my pleasure. Jeremy, tell us a little bit about the lens that you look at things from. We're going to talk about DevOps, and we have a couple of topics that we're going to dive into. But I'd love to understand what's the lens that you look at the world through, and the one thing that people need to know about your experience and where your insights come from.
Yeah, so that's a tough question. At least for me, I worked on some of this a little bit beforehand of trying to think of like where does my experience come from, and what's kind of gotten me here. And there's a lot that make up people and make up their backgrounds. But one thing that I do come back to pretty often is early in my career down the computer science pathway. I went to Transylvania University in Lexington, and we had a freshman class, and obviously that was people testing out the waters and seeing if that's where they wanted to go or if that was the degree for them. And we were very fortunate. We had a meeting where our professors came in to talk to us about that, of like why you should pursue this path, why you should go down computer science, what to expect out of it. Obviously, they gave the examples of, game design or lots of money. People kind of have those ideas about what computer science could be or what a developer or programmer could be. And for some reason, it's just been very impactful to me. The response they gave was that if those are what you're going for, don't do this. Like, that's going to fail. Those aren't, attainable. Sometimes it's going to be really tough. That if you wanted to continue down this path, you needed to have the mindset of always be learning, that you always needed to be pursuing new things. You needed to be seeing what's on the cutting edge. You needed to be trial and error and fail fast. All those terms that I learned over my career really consolidated back to that point of just, always be learning. And thinking on it, it's like, yeah, that's kind of the path that got me here with a lot of stuff, and the lens I see things through just from life experience. Like, I come from a pretty large family in a rural town in Kentucky, and like, I'm the tech support guy, so when I've got, 70 different cousins reaching out sometimes of like, hey, there's this thing going on and there's that, how do we fix it? I have to learn a lot of different things, a lot of different tablets and iPhones and all that stuff to help support. And that kind of goes with it. And then in that town, there's even, businesses and community people from where I grew up that like I help them out sometimes on the weekends. I'll talk through things with them, and just, with my free time, I'll help them with some of their tech questions and tech problems. And it's like that mentality is both in my personal life and in my professional life. So I think it kind of goes back to that point of just like always pursuing learning and pursuing the next challenge.
So you're the person that people need to know in your your town to get things done.
Yeah. I've spent more weekends helping put together, sound systems and helping set up home networks and stuff than I've realized over the years. So when you think back on it, it's like, oh man, I've done a lot of tech support.
Yeah. How much do you enjoy it?
It depends. Like I enjoy the challenge, and typically it's that reward at the end of like fixing the problem, or sometimes you can't fix the problem. Sometimes you find out that like, yep, this problem's insurmountable and here are the reasons why. But like getting that answer, that's always rewarding. But yeah, sometimes dealing with it, and especially when you are helping out a variety of people, you'll get ancient tech, and it's just like, no, this is your better options to abandon all of this and go for something new. So you have to be able to beat your head against the wall, but aiming for that reward at the end is always helpful.
Yeah, absolutely, and the nice cold drink that follows afterwards,
Right.
and the shared
Right.
experience for sure, for
Yeah.
sure. Speaking of learning new things and coming on board with new technologies, and hopefully not too much bashing of the head against the wall.
Right.
You've been on a DevOps transformation journey since 2019 in your organization. How did that come about, and what's that journey been like for you?
Yeah, so I've been with the Pilot company, Pilot Flying J. So we're the massive truck stop company here in the United States. We have our Pilot travel centers and our Flying J travel centers. That's what most people know us for. We have a few other portions of our business, but through that, I was hired on in 2019 to be a senior developer at the time for Salesforce. They were really starting to build out an internal team to support that platform and move it forward. And around that year, our manager at the time decided to review some tools to help us with our deployments and help us modernize and get away from change sets. Really, it is what it is. We all know they're there, but we'd
Yeah.
rather not have to deal with them. So that was really the start. Was evaluating a handful of tools. Gearset obviously came out on top. We really liked how it operated. We were really impressed with the tool, and we really saw a lot of potential in it. Um, for the first couple years with it, we really just had to learn and teach the team how to switch from doing change sets to doing, manual compare and deploys and using those features and getting some things set up. We'd tinker here and there with like testing, automation testing in it and stuff like that. So that was maybe the first couple years running with that process. And then a couple years ago, when we did some transition, how we worked and how the team structure was, we decided, hey, there's a lot more in this tool. There is DevOps. It was becoming a better practice within the company. Obviously, our other custom applications already have DevOps. We have a whole release team set up that runs a lot of that. But Salesforce, as usual, is sometimes a unique beast. And with GearSet, we were using the compare and deploy, and we thought, we're taking on more work. There's more demand, more growth in projects. How do we scale this? How do we support what we're doing? How do we move forward? So that's when we got into the uh, pipeline processing gear set and started really pursuing how the DevOps could help support that and how we could grow. So that's really what drove us toward that, was that there was a lot more demand. There was a lot more projects coming to our team, and we were growing both with our team and with some implementation partners and other projects. So we needed to really be able to support it beyond just the manual compare and deploy processes.
Yeah. What's the coming from that computer science background and software engineering background? How does Salesforce DevOps compare to DevOps of other applications? You mentioned there you have a release team and process for other applications. What's kind of the key difference for you, and how do you see Salesforce DevOps stacked up against normal DevOps?
Yeah, I think that's kind of the struggle. That's some of what we've seen as we've implemented this too, is that, and nothing wrong with it. I don't want that to come across that way, but it's like Salesforce just does things their own way. And they've tried over the years to really expand the developer experience, obviously with DX
Of
taking
course.
that name. But just some of these practices aren't exactly what you would deal with in other products. There's whole different ways to handle everything. You can have builds, you can do your testing, deliver a package to an environment, move all that through and have all that through a pipeline process for traditional development. But then in Salesforce, you're in your orgs. Typically, if you
Mm.
don't have some kind of DevOps practice like we do with GearSet, you are doing org to org movements. You're most likely still using change sets unless you have some other tool to facilitate it. So you are, your source of truth is your org. If you've got it connected to a repository, it could even be how we had started out was like we had a repository, and that was what we put our code in so that we could safely commit code and have a backup of it. But realistically, our source of truth was our orgs. And so you'd have to set up a daisy chain of orgs to kind of mimic a DevOps environment. You'd have your dev box, you'd have maybe an integration and a staging environment, then you'd have your full copy be your UAT or pre-prod, and then you'd go to production. So it does have that idea there, but it's just not fully realized because it is org to org, and the code is obviously low code is one of their big things, and so with that, the developer experience just doesn't fully flesh out for DevOps unless you have a tool to help support it.
Yeah. You mentioned as well you had to take your team on this learning journey as well, and the kind
Yep.
of a personal development journey to kind of get to this stage that you're at now. Something that comes a little bit easier to you based on based on that lens that you've told us about, that always be learning lens and that
Yeah.
curiosity. What's the kind of key to getting the buy-in from your team to invest in a journey like this, where they're used to doing things a certain way? Let's take change sets, for example,
Right.
as you mentioned. We've always done it this way. We know how to do it this way. It's not the best, but
Yeah.
we know how to do it. How do you get the buy-in from the team to go down that learning path with you and put the time and the effort into learning new processes?
Yeah. I would say it's actually two gear sets praise as well. The change sets were an easy one. We all jumped in feet first as soon as we went from change sets to doing compare and deploy and seeing that work. Nobody looked back. Everybody was on board. It was so much easier. It was just more convenient for us. It was a better interface. All the accolades I could give it. Um, that one was definitely no, like hand holding or pulling anyone along. And I think we had the benefit there too of having kind of a mixed experience team. So, we
Mm.
had a handful of people on the team that had multiple years as either a developer or as Salesforce admin. And then we had a few people that were new. So very fortunately for them, they didn't even really have to deal with the old way. When we brought them on, we're like, here's how we do it with gear set. And it was a lot easier. And so sometimes there was the explaining of like, well, this is how we used to do it. And I was like, oh, I don't want to do that. So that really helped. But for us, like for the question you're asking, really the buy-in has been the switch from the manual deployments to the DevOps practice.
Mhm.
And that has been where, like, for myself, it took a little bit to kind of clear that fog of war, as I was calling it, like lift that cloud so I could see the connections between, like, here's traditional DevOps and here is how Salesforce does it, and here's where we need to mix the two. um, Once I got that, it really clicked in my head, but I realized, yeah, I have to make sure that I can explain this where everyone can understand it easily. And it is different when you deal, like, we do have very good separation of admin duties and developer duties here at our workplace. And so teaching the devs is a little bit easier because they're used to those practices with other development. Unless they've only ever done Salesforce experience, then yeah, it's pretty much the same as bringing up an admin. And that was really where we had to like bring people along the journey of like, hey, we've always been doing it with compare and deploy, but what we're going to shift to is this DevOps practice. And that's where you have to answer the tough questions of like, well, this feels slower, or this feels more cumbersome, or I'm going to have to do 5 steps instead of one or two. Like, what's this really giving us? And that's where you have to be able to explain those pros and cons of like, yeah, in the DevOps pipeline, it does take a few more steps and there's a few more things to work through, but we commit everything to our repository and we're shifting to repository as our source of truth. So we get all of those tried and true practices of, code commits, and your repo is your backup, and you can do rollbacks and version control. And then you can also get merge conflicts, which Salesforce really doesn't facilitate, because if you push a change to an org and then I push the one later, I win. You
Mhm.
can blow work and not realize it. Whereas in a repo, it is smart enough to say, wait, there's a difference in these few lines. What do you really want to do here? Um, so it is that, like, you do have to kind of slow down, step back, take a breath with everyone and just say like, yep, I get that it feels like we can run faster if we're just doing our compare and deploy, but at the same time we don't get a lot of these safety features and a lot of these good practices. Let's look at it from a different lens and kind of help them embrace that, like, yeah, let me learn about what I'm doing and learn if there is a better way.
Yeah, I think it's one of those things that we see quite frequently when, especially admins, to call out admins, just because they're used to, like you've already mentioned, there's a couple of steps. However, getting that buy-in in terms of, like you mentioned, security and safety nets as the wording, it's slowing down to once the process becomes familiar, it won't feel as long, first and foremost. But
Yeah.
secondly, you're putting this slightly elevated amount of work in to prevent a hell of a lot of work potentially if something goes wrong, right?
Yes.
And it's
Yes.
that kind of mindset and getting the buy-in, which I always think is there needs to be some kind of there's always a tension around, but there
Hmm.
once if you're speaking to somebody that's had to deal with a catastrophic data loss or metadata corruption or
Yeah.
whatever it may be, they're like, yes, we need to do it this way, because they've experienced that pain. Um, I guess following on from that, what are some of the key improvements within the team that you've seen since adopting some more streamlined DevOps practices?
Yeah. So overall, I would say it's been a boon. We've, like I'd mentioned, we've adopted, tried and true practices. We do have that safety of the repository now. It's not just org to org, and we have the as we streamline our ways of working with this tool and with our practices. it just gives us more trust in what we're doing. It's, you don't have to be like, well, I put it in this org or I moved it to that org. We can follow a path. You get a paper trail through your pipeline deployments. You also get the ability to add in extra features of like PRs. They have, you can
Mhm.
put reviewers on it, and then that way that it's going to be something that people are looking at. You're not just saying like, well, it got to this org, now we need to go check it out. You can have some of that into your process. You don't have to rely on word of mouth or tagging someone on Teams or something like that. The process can say like, yep, here's a PR, I've created it, and then the person that makes it goes and adds 2 or 3 people to it, and they get out there and can review it from that alert. Like, it helps move some of that forward. So um, we've definitely seen that of just the practices are better. We're also not beholden to traditional Salesforce with that. We don't have to rely on multiple orgs and moving a path through that, and obviously the change sets. But we do get, we use GitHub, we do get the version control, we get everything with our repos and the pipeline deploying things for us, getting the reports of those. We've set it up to where it communicates to us through Teams. So again, back to that like automation, we don't have to be monitoring it. We can wait for it to tell us like, hey, this succeeded or this failed, and here's your errors. Click on it to go in and get your details. So it's been a lot of convenience, but it does have peaks and valleys. And I think that's with anything. You're going to have those successes and you're going to have things that fail. You're going to have road bumps along the way, especially as you're learning to implement this. I mean, I mentioned the fog of war earlier. It's like we were really crawling along with how to piece all this together, working with a lot of disparate CI jobs running. We didn't
Mm.
really understand, and I say I was doing a lot of this. I didn't fully understand how to piece it together to a pipeline. And then when that lifted, it's like, oh, no, this is how you take those different pieces, turn them into a functioning pipeline, and let it run for you for your orgs.
Yeah, yeah. It's a really interesting constant evolution, I guess, and that kind of striving, always striving to do
Yeah.
something better and free up more time. I guess is that one of the key reasons that you adopted this DevOps process? To come back to what you said at the start of the conversation, you got more
Mm.
demands on the business, more Salesforce products, more tickets, more users.
Yeah.
Has I guess for the straight question is, has this improved your ability to do that and fulfill business need?
Yeah. I mean, really, that was one of the key, if not the key driving factors, was scalability. Just thinking back to, even the compare and deploy that we were doing, that was great. But I mean, just being blunt, it would have been a nightmare thinking back on some of the projects we've delivered had we had to go through that process. Like, we were getting to what we called deployment trackers from teams. So we were getting a list of the components that needed to be migrated between an org. We'd take our time to go out and select each of those, build a package, validate it, and deploy it through the compare and deploy, which is great and is leaps and bounds above what you could do with a chain set. But that was still, taking half a day or a full day, depending on how much was being delivered, how much was being packaged and tested. So just thinking back on those, like, had we got to this scale and we were still trying to do a lot of that manual intervention, like, nightmare is truly the word, because it would have been so much time and so much dedication of our resources just to deploying things. And while we're still learning and improving our pipeline process here, just what it's given us in time savings and being able to trust a process to deliver things for us without us having to do so much manual work to get it there. That's really been huge. That's definitely like the scale that we were looking for and a driving factor. Um, it does make me, the Futurama is a favorite show of mine. It makes me think of a quote from that where he said, "When you do things right, people won't be sure you've done anything at all." And that's kind of what we're trying to get to with the pipeline. It's like, we want it to be invisible, because before it was so blatant. It was like, yep, I have to give this Excel sheet to so and so on Jeremy's team. We have to wait on them to build it. They have to message us that it's done, that they're validating and all that. And we've really shifted it left to say like, yeah, you're empowered. We've set you up in GitHub with the right access you need. You do all of your commits of your code to feature branch. You do your PR. let the system run validation for you, and it'll message you when it's done. And then if it's
Mm,
good, get your reviews. And when the reviews are in, then the merge button becomes available as long as all the green checks are there. And then once you merge it, the pipeline will move it for you. So we've really moved it to where it is that like it's invisible and it feels like you're not doing anything with it, but that's what we want. Like we don't want someone having to sit there and spend 4 hours a day to help move this. You can spin it up and do it in an hour, if
yeah.
even that. It just depends on how long it takes you to get the reviews and stuff. So
Yeah, and then you can focus on more valuable work. The implementation
yeah,
of the features and all that great stuff that you're trying to build. It's an interesting word that you just used is empowerment, and that's something that
yeah,
I personally talk quite a lot about in terms of DevOps and the cultural side of that shift. And empowerment can be really really healthy for a team, especially kind of like for their morale and how they're feeling about the general processes in general. Is there any anecdotal evidence that you've got of implementing these processes and how it's improved morale of your team?
yeah. I think with that, it's like and I know I mentioned earlier too of like we're working to make it as invisible as possible so that it's just a process. You just do a few things and things run for you. And that's the empowerment we're looking for. Like we don't have to really do as much hands-on with all of these projects. Like before it was like, if this project's running, we definitely have to have someone dedicated to make sure that, yep, when they're ready to go, we switch over, we move all the stuff for them, give them all that feedback. Um, we don't have to really dedicate that now, and that frees up the team to move on to other things that are demanding more of the time. And that's, we're always under pressured for new projects and well, not pressure, but it's like, new demands are coming all the time, and everybody's wanting to move forward and move fast. And that's where we just have to um, be able to empower these teams to use that process that we trust. And then that way we can free up bandwidth of other team members to move on to other projects too. They're not having to always be there. And that's where like we really, especially for like our implementation partners, we've tried to empower them so that they don't even need to know anything about gear set or use it. They can run through. Oh, sorry. The screen went black. I'm sorry.
That's okay, no
Um,
problem.
yeah. But we've empowered them so that they can use the process and run through GitHub and do their commits. And that way they don't even need to worry about gear set or know about it. They just do the code, push the change, wait for the response, do their process that way. And then they don't have to take the time to learn an additional tool. They just learn how to work within the process and then keep running their work.
Yeah, that's an interesting point. That's working with implementation partners. I have often seen throughout my career in this space is there often seems to be a little bit of tension between the end user teams and the consultant teams that are either on a specific project or helping with business as usual tweaks and processes.
Yeah.
How has, or I guess I won't go specific this, but how do you think, or what is your view on how to work effectively with implementation partners, and how do you get the most out of a relationship like that?
Yeah. I think it's, you hear it a lot for even just personal relationships. I would say that the first one is definitely communication. There's always, it's always going to be different until you get into a groove with a team that you're working with. And there can be that tension, and it's not always going to be sunshine and rainbows, and you're going to have to talk through learning opportunities and talk through improvements and ways of working. Like to me, that's ways of working and communication kind of go hand in hand as that part. I know I said communication, but that's, to me, it's, they both really operate together. And that's what we've seen a lot of good practice with is that having that feedback, being able to work with them. You're going to get a variety. You'll get, depending on what you're implementing, whether it's a tool that you're putting into the system or it's an implementation partner to help you build a project, you could have a variety of experience with Salesforce. Obviously, typically you're going to have an implementation partner that's strong in Salesforce, but they might
Mm.
not understand these other practices that come with like a DevOps process of, a repository and committing code and merge conflicts. Things like that could be extremely foreign to them, or they have an understanding of it but don't understand how it works within the Salesforce realm or within your
Right.
particular process. So you're going to have a lot of feedback, and that's where you'll have to balance that too of like, how much do you try to facilitate for the partner? How much do you take on with your team? Where can you improve things in the system so that you can reduce both of those? So it's a lot of feedback around that. And then to me, that kind of leads into the other part that I've seen kind of help us is setting, guidelines or guardrails or standards. However, there's 20 different terms for it, but making sure that those are in place. Like that's something that we've definitely, taken a look at as we've worked through this process internally and worked through it with partners as well. Some advice I wish I could throw back in time to myself is that like those guidelines and those standards aren't always etched in stone. Like some core key practices, yeah, you'll want to like those should be almost no brainers. Like these are exactly what you do and this is how you do it. But you need to make sure that those are written out and that that's an expectation of your team and anyone that you work with. And then with them being guardrails, as you improve your processes and as you improve working with people, different teams, different implementation partners, you'll want to expand those to just add that to your guidelines or your guardrails. So, like this is where we comfortably operate and this is how we get there. And that helps with the communication because then you've got something to fall back on of like, yeah, this is how we operate within our process.
Yeah. Yeah. What are those things that you do have set in stone, or those things that are etched first that you don't have flexibility on?
Yeah, I think a lot of those kind of opposite in Salesforce's favor this way is like because I know I've compared it to like traditional development for DevOps.
Mm,
Salesforce has a lot of really good governance on itself already. There's governor limits, all the pieces that you get tested on as a developer to understand, how many queries, how many records, all of that. So obviously those are definitely key in our standards of like making sure that you adhere to best development practices. But then, especially for us, where we've made a really good distinction between admins and devs, we get to put standards for both of those. So any good admin practices that we come up with, any good development practices that we come up with, we work through them as a team and decide like, yes, this is how we want to operate. Like this is our framework for this portion of code, and this is how we want to go. Web components first, or we're shifting toward this new practice or this new policy with Salesforce. So I think those are definitely the ones that we like etch in stone. Like this is how we should operate. And then what we've been etching in some stone as we grow into this DevOps practice is the other side of it, the more traditional development of like, yeah, here's how you do your feature. When you get done with that, here's how you merge your feature and or not merge, but here's how you open a PR to merge your feature. And here's the expectations on that and the feedback you look for. And that helps you say like, yeah, here's the process. And then you can also say, here's the practices for when you're doing those reviews. So you get both of those start kind of building on each other to help really improve the health of your system.
mm. And I've heard, coming back to consultants, I've heard some horror stories of organizations working with consultants, usually because of a breakdown of communication. But what can sometimes happen, I've found, is a implementation partner team will deploy in a different way to the end user team, and that can cause a lot of friction. And you talk about merge conflicts earlier, and you talk about overwriting of changes and all those kind of things because there's no communication or transparency into what's going on. How do your implementations deploy through your process?
Yeah. So yeah, horror stories will exist everywhere. I mean, just being transparent about it, you're going to have problems. Um, but there are definitely opportunities to improve things and improve your process, the way you work with a partner, the way you build your guidelines, like all the things we've been discussing. It's areas to improve that so that you learn from the lesson. Because honestly, I do think that the best teacher is failure, figuring out
Mm,
how we broke something, how we didn't do something right, where we went wrong, what we missed, things like that help you really build a good ground to move forward on with those. And yeah, we've seen it too, that there's adjustments to how to deploy things. I think fortunately for us, where we have tried to set a lot of this process in stone, um, for the pipelines and how we do our deployments and the orgs that we use and how we branch, all of that. We've really shifted a lot of our implementation partners and a lot of our projects to using that. And fortunately, it's not caused a ton of headache. But if something does go rogue or something isn't operating exactly within the strategy that we want to use, it is something that we realize, yep, this is going to be a persistent issue until we get it corrected, or how do we move forward to resolve it? So that's where you do need to have that, like, it could be a breakdown in communication, but you need to have that communication again of like, hey, this is our process, this is what we want to do, let's talk about why this isn't working, or why we need to shift back to this, or where we went wrong here and how we can fix it. So yeah, it's just having that feedback and making sure that you are flexible to talk through the situations and make sure that everything is working the way it should be, or like resolve the conflicts, whether it be in the process or in the code, resolve those as they come up, but also being rigid in the things that will work and the things that are making the system safe and making the process trustworthy. Like, it is a balancing act, but that's where you'll have to use those to evaluate with your implementation partners and even your internal teams to make sure that everyone's on track with how things should work.
Yeah, I think that's a super important point about rigidity where it's required. There's a lot of talk often in DevOps processes about improving deployment frequency or lead time for change and those kind of things. But if we lose reliability in that process as part of that process, or part of that pursuit of faster deployments or quicker lead times, then you might as well have not started.
Yeah, yeah,
You know.
it's an extreme take, but I mean, to me, it feels like it rings true. But it's like, if you can't trust the process, then what's the value of it? If it's running, and then it's like, well, it's always doing this thing wrong or doing that. It's like you have to clear those so that you can get the process back in line, and that might take tough communication, or that might just take a circle back up and say, like, look, the process should run this way. You're not doing this right, or you're not doing that right. We need to come back together and make sure that we get that fixed so that we don't deal with these issues going forward.
Yeah, for sure. So, what does the future look like, do you think, for your team or for you when it comes to DevOps and the continual journey that you might be on? What do you think the future is for you in that learning path and always be learning mindset?
Yeah, I know for us, it's definitely understanding how we're operating, reviewing our process as it stands today, and making improvements from there. I know we've got a litany of projects that I've thought up in my head, for improving this or adding to it. Obviously, we want to get toward um, better automation testing, larger regression testing, building out a little bit more on our pipeline to make more like pre-prod and staging environments, and just working through some changes we've learned over the time of, like, yeah, we did really focus on a very keep it simple model of trying to make a minimum pipeline, a minimum process, and that way there's not a lot of hoops to jump through to get it to certain environments and to get it into the hands of testers and business to sign off and get things staged to go to production. So we've learned a lot around those, and we see a lot of opportunity to expand that a bit more to where we can have it still run just as fast, but also kind of shift left, shift some of the
Mm,
things to earlier in the development process and earlier in the dev boxes and boxes before it gets to our full copy, and things like that. So I know that's kind of nebulous, but there's just a lot that we're wanting to do with it, and we're balancing that with the work that we're still accomplishing. So you have to do that trade-off of, like, this project has to be delivered, but at the same time, let's see where we can make a plan for the next few months. We're going to add this step to it, or we're going to add this environment and make these checks and make these improvements. So
mm,
yeah, I think that's kind of what we're working on, is just trying to clear some road bumps that we have with the process, make sure that that's buttoned up, but then extend it and shift more of it to the left as we can.
yeah, I think that's the beautiful thing about DevOps and DevOps processes and self DevOps is all about being able to deliver iterative change quickly. And the process itself is iterative change, and you need to continue to look at it and change it and make tweaks based on what your experience is. So I think that's really astute. Jeremy, do you have any one piece of advice for the listeners as kind of a final question to you? One piece of advice for anybody in the Salesforce ecosystem that's either looking at DevOps, the platform in general, about what they can do to become a better Salesforce professional?
Yeah, I swear I didn't plan this, but thinking on it actually kind of circles back to the first thing we talked about of always be learning. Like that's really what's been stand out to me with all of this is that even the practices I did in college and when I first started my CS career of learning version control and learning repositories, like I'm having to revisit that all again with a new lens and figure out how does this work with a tool that manages it for me, and how does this work for a platform that's not traditionally built that way. Like having to learn how to implement it, and then having to learn how to teach it to people, and then having to learn how to bring on people for short durations to work with with implementation partners. It's like it really always does come back to like, how did I learn to do it? How can I help people learn how to do it? And how can I teach others to pick up these tools and trust them and run with them?
Yeah. Second final question then. Where are the best resources, and where do you recommend people go to learn about either DevOps or anything Salesforce related? And what are there any blogs or anything that you've found super helpful in your journey that you could point people to?
Yeah, well, I think it's pretty obvious for anyone that's in Salesforce that my recommendation is going to be Trailhead. They definitely do a really good job of providing a very comprehensive free catalog of learning through that site for Salesforce. I would say for the DevOps, definitely partial to GearSet, so I would recommend your all's Launchpad. That definitely helps a lot. You guys have similar to Trailhead. You have a module learning system out there for both learning and certification as well. So that's been helpful. And then I know for myself, at least when we run into a lot of this, it's more reading through your all's blogs, reading through GearSet blogs, and reaching out to you guys. So I can add a lot of recommendation for that too, because that's been very helpful to get that feedback or see the knowledge that you guys have already written of like, here's a FAQ article on how to do this. Like it's been helpful.
Perfect. Jeremy, thank you so much for sharing your experience with the DevOps Diaries listeners. I really value it. So, and I hope the listeners have too. Speaking of which, listeners, if you have enjoyed this episode of DevOps Diaries, please give it a like and subscribe on whatever platform you are listening to. And Jeremy, thank you once again for your time. I really appreciate it.
Oh, thank you, Jack. I appreciate the opportunity.
All right. Thank you, sir.
Thanks.